am delighted to welcome you tonight to hear Sir Antony Beevor. I couldn't believe that he would accept my invitation. He is, as all of you know, one of our most distinguished military historians, and he combines scholarly insight with actual practical personal experience. After Sandhurst, he served as a lieutenant in the 11th Hussars, commanding a troop of tanks in Germany during the Cold War. And as one of the most widely read historians of our time, his books have been translated into 37 languages. They've won numerous awards and have sold more than 9 million copies. Many of us will have read and admired his accounts of Stalingrad, the downfall of Berlin, D-Day, Arnhem, the Russian Revolution, Spanish Civil War, and the Second World War. Described by his fellow historian Dan Snow as the gold standard of narrative history, Sir Antony's latest book, Rasputin and the Downfall of the Romanovs, is available from all respectable booksellers and also from Amazon. Sir Antony, his subject this evening is history and our repetition of mistakes, a title that some politicians today may find uncomfortably apt. We meet with gathering clouds of uncertainty in Europe, conflict in Ukraine, and instability across the world. These are anxious times. The lessons of history should matter to our parliamentarians. History can guide, warn, illuminate, and challenge. In politics, as in life, what matters is judgment, the courage to decide in difficult circumstances when the choices are rarely clearly cut. And I believe Sir Antony can help us to think more deeply about how we can be guided, if not led, by history. So please welcome Sir Antony Beevor to deliver this evening's Lord Speaker's lecture. Sir Antony.
Lord Speaker, thank you very much indeed. It is indeed a great honour, and I'm very grateful for the invitation. The most vital reason to study history is to avoid repeating strategic mistakes. Yet when politicians and the media feel compelled to look back to the past, it is usually to simplify or dramatize their message. In moments of turmoil, we feel the need to understand, so we search for a pattern, but history never provides one that is accurate, and history is never predictive. I find it both amusing and deeply frustrating that historians are constantly invited onto news programs to make parallels with the past and then ask what will happen next, as if our prime purpose was to foretell the future. Predicting the future from the past is not a new urge. Over 2,500 years ago, Thucydides was promoting the idea. It will be enough for me, he wrote, if these words of mine are judged useful by those who want to understand events in the past, and which, human nature being what it is, will at some time or other be repeated in the future. It may be human nature to repeat the mistakes of the past, but that does not mean that it is the past itself which repeats. In any case, we must watch out for political leaders and the media making misleading historical parallels with earlier events. Even resemblances with a grain of truth can distract, such as Harold Macmillan's suggestion in the Second World War that the British should play the role of Greek advisors in the new Roman Empire of the United States. Far worse, the Second World War itself soon became the dominant reference point for almost every crisis and conflict. And yet it was a war like no other, being a conglomeration of many different conflicts. It also brought world history together for the first time through its global reach and because it accelerated the end of colonization, of colonialism. The ending of the Cold War around 1990 produced a wildly optimistic re-examination of geopolitics. Everyone started to talk of the peace dividend. Yet few recognized that the Cold War had been keeping the world in splints or a straitjacket for nearly half a century. When it suddenly ended, old hatreds began to resurface. Azeris and Armenians, Georgians and Abkhazians. Ethnic cleansing by paramilitary groups in the former Yugoslavia shocked the West. We found ourselves in the so-called CNN curve of the something must be done syndrome. In more official language, this was defined as armed humanitarianism in the UN Security Council Resolution 794 of December 1992. Yet there was no proper debate about the impact of the ending of the Cold War on international law and the basic premise of the UN itself that national sovereignty was sacrosanct. Whether or not armed humanitarianism worked as it was supposed to, most of the examples were not exactly encouraging. It provoked discussions on the new role of the soldier in the 21st century, even if some of the ideas proved revealingly mistaken. The American academic Edward Luttwak compared the future role of peace enforcers to those of heavily armored Roman legionaries in outposts along the frontiers of the civilized world. But with the increase in travel and growing waves of immigration into Europe, frontiers were soon no longer what they had been during the Cold War. The enemy was no longer at the gates. They could be within the walls as well. The most dangerous parallels we have continued to make with the past are to do with war, especially the way an enemy is dubbed another Hitler. In 1956, during the Suez Crisis, Anthony Eden compared Nasser to Hitler. Then, during the Vietnam War, American leaders convinced themselves that Ho Chi Minh was another Adolf Hitler. Nobody wanted to be seen as an appeaser. Immediately after 9/11, George W. Bush compared the attack on the Twin Towers to Pearl Harbor. Tony Blair and neocons in Washington then went on to portray Saddam Hussein as another Hitler when he was, if anything, a poor man's Stalin. As well as the gross oversimplification, statesmen were tempted to sound Churchillian or Rooseveltian in moments of international upheaval. But historical parallels can lead world leaders to very dangerous strategic confusion. Bush's mistake of linking 9/11 to Pearl Harbor redirected thinking into state-on-state warfare rather than treating al-Qaeda as a security problem. And now comparisons are being made in Washington by people who should know better between the Iran war and the Vietnam War, and even between the war in Ukraine and the Korean War. The media have always been just as bad, if not worse. Some 3 months before the 2003 Iraq war started, the Financial Times asked me to write an article on why the Battle of Baghdad would be another Stalingrad. In refusing this commission, I tried to explain that history doesn't repeat itself, but perhaps rhymes, as Mark Twain suggested. The features editor in question clearly thought that such concerns should not be allowed to spoil a good piece. As war fever mounted in February and March of 2003, I came under a barrage of telephone calls and emails from other features editors in search of articles by armchair experts. To my bewilderment and dismay, they all wanted a Stalingrad Baghdad article. And they all sounded so pleased with the originality of their brainwave, and then so disappointed when I told them they were not exactly the first to think of it. I explained my refusal time and again. There was one young man from the Daily Mail who demanded an assurance that I would not write the article for anyone else. Even The Sun had the same idea. I had a terrifying vision of how such an article might be illustrated in their pages, all accompanied by a headline fearlessly upholding that publication's reputation for exquisite bad taste. The only person I had any sympathy for was a young woman from the Today programme who rang in some embarrassment to ask whether I would discuss historical parallels. I pointed out that they'd tried that the week before. I know, she said, but we're desperate, and the war had not even started. It's not just the obsession with analogy which is the problem. It is also the repetition of particular mistakes, which I find striking. In 1909, the political journalist Norman Angel published The Grand Illusion, a title later borrowed by Jean Renoir for his famous film. In this book, he argued that a continental war in Europe was impossible to imagine because of the close relationships between countries due to commerce and communications. The economic cost of the war was so great that it was plainly in nobody's interest. The book became a huge bestseller across Europe. But when the First World War broke out in 1914, it was quickly forgotten. Yet astonishingly, the book was revived in 1933, the year that Hitler came to power, and Norman Angel was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. I should mention that Neil Ferguson claimed in The Pity of War that the book was in fact secretly intended as a scaremonger, but I'm not convinced by this theory. Rather more to the point, it's the fact that following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the federal chancellors Gerhard Schröder and Angela Merkel believed, just like Angel, that increased trade with Putin's Russia would prevent future conflict in Europe. They had clearly forgotten the past. In the 1920s and early 1930s, both the British and the French governments were convinced that nobody could be mad enough to want another war in Europe following the horrors of the First World War. They completely underestimated the pockets of anger and resentment in Germany and Hitler's determination to have another war to reverse the outcome of 1918. Similarly, during the first 2 decades of the 21st century, most Western European nations could not imagine anyone mad enough to start another major conflict on the Eurasian landmass. Only those frontline states who had experienced Soviet occupation remained on their guard and wanted to join NATO. We failed to see that Vladimir Putin wanted to reverse the humiliating collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990 and in fact recreate the Russian Empire. This is what Vladimir Medinsky and Alexander Dugin, known as Putin's brain, called neo-Eurasianism in their scrambled thinking. They have called for Russian Orthodox control of the whole landmass from Vladivostok to Dublin. Our fundamental problem is essentially one of democratic confirmation bias. We in the West simply cannot understand the narcissistic mentality of dictators and the way dictatorships work. For example, following the bomb explosion at Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia on the 20th of July 1944, American and British commanders alike gravely misinterpreted the consequences. They assumed that any army in which senior officers plot to blow up their commander-in-chief must be in a state of disintegration. So they believed that the war would be over in a matter of a few weeks. The Pentagon even began to cancel ammunition production contracts. What they utterly failed to comprehend was that Hitler's survival of the blast meant that the Wehrmacht would be forced to fight on to the very end by the Nazi Party, the SS, and the Gestapo. And that end could only come with Hitler's death. The British, it must be acknowledged, were slightly more perspicacious in one way. During that same year of 1944, they recognized that Hitler's inflexible conduct in military affairs was working in the Allies' favor. So SOE's plan to assassinate Hitler, known as Operation Foxley, was cancelled. What they did not know was that at roughly the same time, Stalin cancelled the NKVD's plans to kill Hitler. They had hoped to use the champion boxer Igor Miklaveshevsky, who had been ordered to cross over to the enemy during the siege of Leningrad. But Stalin's reason for preserving Hitler were rather different. In his paranoid way, he feared that if Hitler were killed, the Western Allies might make a deal with a successor regime in Germany and allow it to carry on a single-front war against the Soviet Union. Why were we so shocked in the opening weeks of the Russian invasion of Ukraine when news of the massacre of Bucha emerged? Why do Russian soldiers treat civilians so cruelly? The answer is that the Russian army treats its own people in such a humiliating way that their soldiers take it out on civilian victims. It is all part of the knock-on theory of oppression. Yet we still find that it is hard to understand because we could not imagine it happening here. We had already forgotten the hideous brutality of the Russian war in Chechnya and in Syria. It is also hard for us to grasp the fact that in Ukraine, Russian officers forced their own soldiers to pay them bribes to stay out of dangerous operations. Or the so-called expendables, usually Africans or Asians who've been tricked into joining the Russian army, are sent into the attack with mines strapped to them like suicide bombers. That kidnapped Ukrainian teenagers have been brainwashed or forced into fighting their own people. These are all war crimes, but the old Soviet idea still lingers: nobody judges a victor. And yet history tells us that a loser can be even more vicious. Once again, our confirmation bias makes us blind to the fact that no country is as much a prisoner of its own past as Russia. The Russian army's belief that conspicuous cruelty is an essential weapon of war goes back to the Mongol invasions of the 13th century. Western Europe could be equally savage right up to the Peace of Westphalia. But the real difference came in the 18th century with the Enlightenment, which in Russia did not extend beyond Catherine the Great's correspondence with Voltaire and friendship with Diderot. On the other hand, in the West, the creation of the Red Cross followed the Battle of Solferino, and at the end of the 19th century came the Hague Convention. The extension of the Russian Empire into the Caucasus, Central Asia, Siberia, and the Far East had meanwhile continued with the same savagery of the Cossack hosts. Yet far worse was to follow in the Civil War of 1917 to 1921, which stretched from the Baltic and the Adriatic in the west to the North Pacific in the Far East. It led to between 6 and 10 million dead, appalling destruction, famine, disease, and pointless torture. The horrors were such that it became an even more influential conflict than the so-called original catastrophe of the First World War. The circle of fear and hate between left and right, communism and fascism, spread right across Europe and beyond, and created the pattern of conflict of the 20th century. In Spain, the socialist Prime Minister Largo Caballero gloried in the nickname of the Spanish Lenin and promised the annihilation of the bourgeoisie, while on the extreme right, Calvo Sotelo and other leaders threatened to crush the increasingly militant trades unions. Some Spanish historians have tried to argue that words do not kill. Yet, the vicious circle of rhetoric in the Cortes led to the murder of Calvo Sotelo, the leader of the opposition, and this proved the final trigger for the Civil War. We are entering dangerous times again, with populist leaders of extreme left and right starting to engage in another vicious circle of hostile rhetoric. In the United States, the shift to the extremes has produced terrifying levity about the Holocaust. Nick Fuentes, above all, has contributed to the normalization of Holocaust denial by lampooning the Holocaust in an attempt to make it a subject for ridicule. This has brought in many young followers, eager to break taboos about the Second World War and enjoying the shock of older conservatives. Some of these ideas go back to the early 1940s, of America first, with the false notion that it was the Jews who dragged the United States into the Second World War. Meanwhile, national conservatives, or NatCons, such as President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance, go back even further in their attempt to insist that to be truly American, you have to be of Anglo-Saxon origin, either British or German, like Trump himself. And this is, of course, white supremacy writ large. Along with all states, but especially the Russian Federation with its variety of nationalities, the United States has no national DNA. What can exist, of course, is a national self-image from a so-called collective memory, which encourages people to behave in certain ways. This phenomenon seems to have become particularly pronounced during the Second World War. Dutch civilians suffering the Nazi occupation could not get over the way the Germans felt obliged to shout commands the whole time to demonstrate their authority. And according to a number of accounts, Waffen-SS officers really did say to British prisoners, "For you the war is over." The British, perhaps convinced of their own moral superiority, adopted what one might call an inverted self-deprecation. Canadians and Americans could not get over the way the British felt compelled to joke in adversity or halt to make tea in the afternoon even when a battle was going on. And British officers referred to going into action as going to a party. All of this really irritated the Poles, for whom the war was a fight not just for survival, but their very identity as a nation. Untraveled American troops, meanwhile, were confused by all the different European nations and which country they were in. Despite all the official attempts to explain Europe before D-Day, an alarming number of GIs assumed that because France was a country occupied by the Germans, it was thus an enemy country. And that great Yankee cynic, Ambrose Bierce, had put it half a century earlier, war is God's way of teaching Americans geography. Collective memory is indeed a dangerous phenomenon, but do not let us forget that individual memory is deeply fallible. The recent fashion for oral history came about partly as a result of changing emphasis in academic circles, switching from top-down and more general approaches to focusing on the experiences of the individual. That is all very well in terms of human empathy, but how accurate is the result? In the days after the Twin Towers were destroyed in New York, Columbia University had the inspired idea of setting up a large oral history project to record people's memories of 9/11. The project would run initially for 3 years and then for 10 altogether. The way that individual memory changed was striking. Collective memory, shaped by television programs, newspaper articles, conversations, and news reports, had introduced so many different facts and images that people's personal impressions were radically altered. Frankly, I find it unbelievable that official inquiries into past events, say 10, 20, or even 40 years ago, such as those which took place in Northern Ireland, can be taken seriously for a moment. Human memory is simply not up to resisting external influences. The point is not merely that countries and individuals are incapable of objectivity. It is that we are all too often tempted to believe that we know more than we do. A little learning is indeed a dangerous thing and leads all too easily to a distortion of history. The great Spanish historian Salvador de Madariaga emphasized the old saying that history is a common meadow in which everyone can make hay. And of course, this is above all true of nationalists bending history to their propaganda myths. This can extend from what Professor Sir Michael Howard termed nursery history right up to the outright falsification of the past. The other danger, which comes more from the liberal side, is what Professor Norman Davies just termed psychoanachronism, the historically illiterate compulsion to impose the morals and values of today on periods of the past. The duty of the historian, surely, is not to make moral judgments. It should be to understand the context, the mood, and the attitudes of the time, and convey that as accurately as possible to their readers, who, with the hindsight which their forebears did not have, can then make a more informed opinion themselves. History is also affected by the law of unintended and unexpected consequences. Events and their outcomes can be totally unpredictable. Not surprisingly, there have been furious arguments over the strategic bombing offensive against German cities in the Second World War, both on the grounds of morality and effectiveness. And yet few have recognized that the most important consequence was felt on the Eastern Front. Hitler was so infuriated by the bombing of Germany in 1943 that he ordered the withdrawal of Luftwaffe squadrons and anti-aircraft batteries from the Russian front in order to defend the Reich. This handed air superiority to Red Army aviation and greatly accelerated the Soviet advances into Central Europe. The 88mm anti-aircraft guns were also the Wehrmacht's most effective anti-tank guns. And the bombing campaign proved in its way the most effective version of the Second Front, which Stalin had been demanding since 1941. Another unrecognized example was the disastrous Dieppe raid of 1942, which may even be some consolation for the terrible Canadian losses. The conspicuous Allied failure there, in fact, made a major contribution to the successes of D-Day 2 years later. This was because it convinced Hitler that Germany did not need to invest any more in its so-called Atlantic Wall along the Channel coast. The concrete went instead into reinforced submarine pens. A senior American intelligence officer gave me a more recent example during the Second Gulf War. Thanks to GCHQ intercepts shortly before the invasion of Iraq, the Allies had obtained the mobile telephone numbers of all the divisional commanders of Saddam Hussein's Republican Guards. So the Iraqis working for the CIA were told to ring up these generals on the eve of the attack to offer them large sums of money if they simply kept their forces where they were and didn't move. These Republican Guard generals were terrified. They were convinced it must be a trick by Saddam Hussein himself to test whether they were loyal. So in a panic, they switched off their phones. And when the initial air and cruise missile attacks destroyed the Iraqi military communications network, the only way Saddam could contact his commanders was by their mobile telephones, but he could not get through because they were all switched off. Let me finish by re-emphasizing the danger of historical parallels. We must never take seriously Karl Marx's little joke that history repeats itself, the first time is tragedy, the second is time is farce. My favorite joke of his, on the other hand, was his complaint in the 1850s that Britain was the only country in the world where the working class was as bourgeois as the monarchy. As I was saying, history never repeats itself, even if it occasionally rhymes with preceding events. And this is why it can never provide a template to the future. But it is vital if we want to avoid repeating dangerous mistakes. And it can flag up important warning systems, or warning signals, which are often overlooked. For example, one important factor leading to the French Revolution was the unemployment level among frustrated graduates and young lawyers. And today we hear of the tech titans now booed bitterly in American universities when before they were greeted like minor deities. Not surprisingly, this fear and loathing among the young comes with the shock of an unexpectedly unprecarious future. Societies simply cannot absorb more than a certain amount of social and economic change at a time. The pattern of previous pre-revolutionary periods is uneven. 1789, 1848, 1917, 1968, 1989. Not all, of course, led to outright revolution. But certain common factors include national impoverishment due to war or heavy defense spending, unemployment among embittered and disillusioned graduates, and the reality or perception of extremes between poverty and wealth. The emphasis on super yachts and private jets today has been accentuated by the media obsession with lives of the rich and famous, what might more succinctly be termed Pluto porn. In any case, I would go no further than raising the distinct possibility that we are now entering a pre-revolutionary period, as well as already finding ourselves in the grey zone of war. Thank you very much indeed. No questions, indeed.
Well, I'm going to ask Field Marshal, the Lord Houghton, to say a vote of thanks in a few moments, but I'd just like to say personally, what a magnificent evening. You've taken us through the arc of history, and you've given us a great deal to think about and to prepare for. I was quite struck about your point about democratic confirmation bias in the context of what has happened in Ukraine. And you mentioned the people being sent back to the front. I showed a film here for peers, which is called Second Wind. And it was about 4 Ukrainian soldiers, men and women, who'd had severe injuries, lost limbs, and had severe injuries fighting at the front. And they went to climb Kilimanjaro in order to demonstrate their courage and resolve. And they did that. And the film shows the agony and the pain and the suffering and the comradeship that took them to the top. And then they went back to the front to fight again. And this inspiring courage, which guarantees all other values, was really extraordinary to see. And I have to say, the audience, which was mainly members of the House of Lords, we were all surreptitiously getting out our hankies because we were so moved by it. So, yes, there may be amongst young people a feeling of this is not for us, but these young Ukrainians were really inspiring. And then the other thing I would just like to say about your remarks, your warning about the possibility that we're entering a pre-revolutionary period was equally arresting. And I think both these points will stay with us for many years. And we're very grateful to you for the way in which you've dealt with our questions. So without further ado, can I ask Field Marshal, the Lord Houghton of Richmond, former Chief of the Defence Staff, to show our appreciation.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be asked to offer our thanks to Sir Antony tonight for what's been a hugely enjoyable, if somewhat sobering evening. It's also a real indulgence that the Lord Speaker's granted me 5 minutes to do so, far more time than a member usually gets to speak in the average debate. So I felt obliged to forego inspired spontaneity and offer something a little more personal and considered. I joined the army in 1973, just a few years after Lieutenant Beevor, to my left, was leaving the 11th Hussars. That army, he might recall, I remember it well, was in retrospect comfortably occupied keeping the peace, either in Northern Ireland or in the British Army of the Rhine. And our opportunities for excitement and risk abounded, but they sat within a wider context of comfortable predictability. By the time I was 23, I'd done 3 tours of Northern Ireland, spent 8 months in Berlin, amongst other things guarding Rudolf Hess, and I'd managed to pass the Oxford entrance exam. Oxford in my mid-20s allowed me the great privilege of studying history for fun rather than to meet the demands of some future career. My only real obligation was to take military history and the theory of war as my specialist subjects, and that provided me with a remarkable opportunity to study Clausewitz on a one-to-one basis with Sir Michael Howard. I also studied Sir Julian Corbett's Principles of Maritime Strategy, knowledge which later gave me an edge over some of my Navy colleagues, many of whom knew little about the art of maintaining naval blockade in the age of sail. Some 40 years later, when I stood down as the Chief of Defence, I took up the wonderful post of Constable of Her Majesty's Tower of London. I was the 160th Constable. My earliest predecessor, Geoffrey de Mandeville, was appointed by William the Conqueror, primarily due to his outstanding bravery at the Battle of Hastings. The Constable enjoys the enormous privilege of living in the Queen's, now the King's House, the oldest Tudor house in London which survived the Great Fire of 1666 due to the protection of the outer walls of the complex. The dining room of the house is where Guy Fawkes was interrogated. It's the house which guards the entrance to the Bell Tower, where Sir Thomas More spent the last 18 months of his life. It's where the first Princess Elizabeth was imprisoned as a 17-year-old girl. And it was the place designated by Churchill for the potential imprisonment of Hitler. The Queen's House has a most wonderful cigar terrace where at night, when the crowds have gone home and the White Tower is illuminated, with a malt whisky in one hand and a Sliglo number 4 in the other. You can look at the tower and reflect on a building that's borne witness to 1,000 years of British history, the evolution of our great nation. I offer all this background as personal context to the thoughts that I have on history and its continuing relevance to conflict, thoughts which I think entirely complement Sir Antony's lecture tonight. One of the greatest things that separates humankind from the rest of the animal world is our capacity for imagination. We're capable of both ordering and sharing imagined thought. And when we think historically, we ascribe real power to the content of stories which are really just products of that imagination. As Hilary Mantel once reflected, the history we learn in schools is not really the past. It's how we organize our ignorance of that past. In truth, we only know a fraction of the past that is authentic fact, and the rest is down to the human capacity for ordered imagination to create. This is part of Sir Antony's great skill as a writer. Dangerously, however, the human capacity to both order and share imagined thought has created not just alternate histories, but conflicted truth. Conflicted about the things that we now most passionately believe in: great religions, political movements, nationality, a sense of historic entitlement, racial superiority, even the prospects of national football teams. The most important thing that I've come to learn about history is it's not an exam that you sit and hopefully pass. History is something that you live in and are connected to, both rationally and emotionally. So much of what now explains the ambitions and actions of nations, their leaders, their people, is only explicable through history's emotional legacy. Arguably, Britain cannot help but be intoxicated by our own glorious and emotional legacy. We are its prisoners, and it partly explains why we find it so difficult to come to terms with our somewhat diminished status. So tonight I think Sir Antony has both reminded and forewarned us of some vitally important things regarding history. The extreme danger of looking to history for certainty about the future, the degree to which and the remarkable speed at which time warps memory, the extent to which we are prisoners of an emotional legacy that shapes and fixes public attitudes, but finally the degree to which history can alert us to the signs of pending crisis, particularly the alienation of youth, the start of social disintegration, the advent of change at a pace and scale that is very hard to accommodate peacefully. So, Antony, you have given us entertainment of a most stimulating and sobering kind, and on everybody's behalf, can I offer you our most sincere thanks.